This is another lecture for the module Body Image, as you know, but we're on coronavirus lockdown, so I'm recording it for you now. Hopefully, I decided I'd put my smiling face on for you because those of you who sent in presentations, and I really like to, I found that it's really nice when I also see the person speaking rather than just hearing the disembodied voice. So I thought that it does add something extra, actually be able to see a physical person. So here I am in my daughter's bedroom because the kids are home, so they're downstairs making a noise, so I'm kind of self-isolating up here. But today's theme is the what I've called the modern ancient body. And what do we mean by that? So what we mean by that, this is what I wrote in the module. Oh, that's a bit big, isn't it? That doesn't quite work. This might be a problem when we zoom in on things. So I'll try and do it manually. Okay, so this, if you can read it, but if not, the Prezi itself is online, so you can search as usual for Paul Bowman Prezi, and you should be able to find this one. So I've written there are different paradigms or worldviews of the body. The supposed difference between Eastern and Western worldviews is a well-known case. For instance, in the Western rendition of this difference, the Western view is said to be rational, objective, scientific, whereas the Eastern is said to be holistic, naturalistic, and based on a radically different cosmology and theory of the body. We will consider some of these perceived differences this week. Of course, given that we are neither scientists nor experts in such practices as traditional Chinese medicine on this module, we can't make declarations about right and wrong. What we can do, though, is examine the ways in which ideas about science, say, versus traditional wisdom, work in the contemporary world, and as images have effects on bodies. So this week we'll examine representations of science vis-à-vis the body, the scientifically enhanced body, the medicated subject, etc., and ancient wisdom. We will look at the romanticization and demonization of science, the wisdom of the ancients, the emergence of New Age ideology and lifestyles, Slavoj Žižek's arguments about Western Buddhism as the New Age Taoism or Taoism as an exemplary ideology of late capitalism. We'll explore the ways in which certain body types are mythologized in Western popular culture, e.g. the mystical old Chinese man, the invention and popularity of modern postural yoga, and body image ideals. So there'll be two halves to this lecture. The first half we're going to start with the science and move on and finish on some yoga, so to speak, which might be an ideal thing for us to spend more time doing now that we're supposed to be socially distancing and self-isolating. So we've got this the East and West difference. So, the idea is that, claim is that in the West, we tend to think of a body as a physical machine, and if there's something wrong with it, we might pop pins in it, we might pop medicine in it, like a chemical to solve it. Whereas in the East, there are chakras, meridians, it's an organic whole, and we'll treat it differently. So here's the idea. In the West, the idea is that the body is more of a machine, whereas in the East, it's regarded more as a garden, more as a holistic, complex, functioning system. So this, I quite like these pictures. So the idea of that these old ideas of the human body as mechanistic. What else is there so other sort of paradigms that we have here? I mean, in the West, we deal with things now that supposedly the modern Western diet is fake and synthesized and manufactured and over-treated, and therefore the human body as a kind of ancient animal thing is not equipped to deal with it. So nowadays we have this kind of neo-primitivism where we look back and think, well, what did Stone Age humans eat, and isn't that what our bodies evolved to eat? So we have all these different, the idea of the West as modern, or the idea of modernity as something associated with the West, and modern diets as something associated with a Western worldview, which is coming back to kind of bite us on the bum, so to speak. The paradigm has failed. And here's another kind of depiction of the East-West binary, the Western doctor with the stethoscope and the Eastern doctor with herbs and spices and so on. There's an East versus West type thing. Pills again, popping pills, medicated, big pharma, sorting this out. Whereas the East has this idea of ancient, more naturalistic, and therefore better. Yeah, or maybe it's just their kind of hippie ideology. So we're dealing with these different kinds of paradigms which become polarized. So the idea of the wisdom of the ancients is an idea that became very popular in the West during modernity and also like post-modernity. So it's not a new idea to look at, for Westerners to have looked at other cultures, Eastern cultures, normally Asian cultures, and regard them because of their long history as possessing truths that the West has somehow lost, or the West doesn't have, or the West never had. So traditional Chinese medicine is regarded as something ancient with a long life that's therefore must be superior to the machinations of Western science, and people argue that it's connected with capitalism, and if something's connected with capitalism and the profit motive, then therefore it's not to be trusted. Obviously, scientists disagree with this, and they say, no, we follow the science, but there have been lots of studies which have exposed the kind of complex relationships between the profit motive, pharmaceutical companies, and other research, and medical research, which is being funded by pharmaceutical companies, and drawn it into some suspicion, some doubt. So when I was thinking about where to start here, I remembered there's a book called The Rebel Cell by Heath and Potter, which came out some time ago, quite some time now. It's how the counterculture became the consumer culture. And they spent some time, quite a lot of time, looking at countercultural myths and ideologies and beliefs. And one of it's an interesting book. It's polemical. I don't agree with all of it, but they make a really interesting point. And it's that but people seem to give a lot of respect to kind of say like the Chinese elements, and to the ideas of Chinese medicine around say chakras or meridians or different kind of points in the body. And they say, but if someone turned to you and you had a problem and they referred back to the kind of medieval ancient European elements, such as these different biles, these different humours, right? Yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, blood, and these are different. And this kind of ancient medical paradigm, the one in which they would, if you had an ailment, they would look at you and say, "Oh, you've got too much black bile, so therefore you need to have blood let. You need to have a pin stuck in your arm and blood let out of your body, or at a certain place." You would just laugh at them now. You would ridicule that, and they say, "But how come we can spot that? We can spot that BS when it's ancient European humour theory, right? How can we spot that? But at the same time as that, we'll respect these, which they regard are equally preposterous, ancient Asian terms, concepts, and paradigms." And that's a very interesting question. I mean, why? On what evidence do we accept certain ancient or New Age holistic ideas and ideals? But by the same token, the origins of Western science have equally kind of occult origins, equally problematic origins. So the separation between astronomy, which is the study of actual celestial bodies, and astrology, which is the study of the relationship between, which is the relationship between those bodies and our personalities. that's not science now. I always found astrology quite interesting. I loved it when I was a teenager. I thought it was fab. Um, and my auntie was big into it, and she did us all our astrological star charts, which are our specific ones tailored for the moment when we were born. And I read it, and I read mine, and said that I was really good, and I was a nice person. And I thought, well, I'll take that. It was complete confirmation bias. Anyway. But what we also see now in this binary between West and East is not a simple or permanent binary, because there's a lot of kind of middle ground hybrids which are associated with the counterculture, with hippies and the Beat generation before them that had turned away from the West for lots of reasons. The industrialized West was responsible, remember, for the machine-like mass production kind of Holocaust in Germany. It was responsible for the atomic bomb, which had been dropped on Japan. It was responsible also for like the mass production of deaths: the First World War, the First Mechanized War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. All of these traumatic events produced a counterculture which rejected, say, Western Christianity, Western rationality, Western science, and wanted to look for an alternative. And the alternative that they found was these ancient cultures, Indian, East Asian cultures. And from this, we have the development of all sorts of kind of New Age, sort of neo-pagan, hippie-ish kind of beliefs in the veneration of nature or Gaia or whatever, and the production of concepts and paradigms like homeopathy, which is where you have a tiny proportion of something. It's kind of like a weird vaccine theory, isn't it, where you have a tiny proportion of some herb or spice or medicine, and that tiny proportion somehow works exponentially to cure you. So there's a long-running kind of debate and also transformation and combination of different elements between Eastern and Western ideas. It has a history, it develops, it's ongoing. And in these you have, I guess the point for this module is that you have different images of the body, the holistic ecosystem like East Asian body exemplified in traditional Chinese medicine or in certain kind of Hindu theories of the body, versus a mechanistic Western version. West has often been associated with the mechanical, right? The machine, like the mass production, right? And I mean, there's a lot of possible digressions here, but when I was writing this lecture, there was a little reminiscence in my head, and it was a reminiscence of a section from a book by Umberto Eco. Now, Umberto Eco was a magnificent novelist and a great Italian cultural theorist, a semiotician. He kind of pioneered the field of semiotics, but he also wrote these great books, often based on an enormous amount of historical research. And Foucault's Pendulum is kind of like, it's the book that inspired the Da Vinci Code, and the Da Vinci Code is actually a much more simplistic, like really emetic kind of crap version of one of the possible themes within Foucault's Pendulum, which is much more sophisticated. Anyway, there's a scene in which two people are talking about their partners. They're in a relationship, and they're talking about magic, but what if there's something in this magic? But what if there's some universal truth in this magic and this occult kind of stuff? And I found it again. I don't have a copy of the book, so I just did a Google book search. And it's the girlfriend, I think, giving a lecture to the boyfriend, the boyfriend's having a really hard time and freaking out about in the face of this occult world that he's just discovered. So we move on to the magic numbers your authors are so fond of. You are 1 and not 2. Your cock is 1, sorry, and my cunt is 1. And we have 1 nose and 1 heart. So you see how many important things come in ones. But we have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, my breasts, your balls, legs, arms, buttocks. 3 is the most magical of all, because our body doesn't know that number. We don't have 3 of anything, and it should be a very mysterious number that we attribute to God wherever we live. But if you think about it, I have 1 cunt and you have 1 cock. Shut up and don't joke. And if we put these two together, a new thing is made, and we become three. So you don't have to be a university professor or use a computer to discover that all cultures on Earth have ternary structures, trinities. But 2 arms and 2 legs make 4. And 4 is a beautiful number when you consider that animals have 4 legs and little children go on all fours, as the Sphinx knew. We hardly have to discuss 5, the fingers on the hand, and then with both hands you get that other sacred number, 10. There have to be 10 commandments because if there were 12, when the priest counts 1, 2, 3, holding up his fingers, and comes to the last 2, he'd have to borrow a hand from the sacristan. Now, if you take the body and count all the things that grow from the trunk, arms, leg, head, and cock, you get 6. But for women, it's 7. For this reason, it seems to me that among your authors, 6 is never taken seriously except as the double of 3, because it's familiar to the males who don't have any 7. So when the males rule, they prefer to see 7 as the mysterious sacred number, forgetting about women's tits, but what the hell. 8. Give me a minute. If arms and legs don't count as 1 apiece but 2 because of elbows and knees, you have 8 parts that move. Add the torso and you have 9. And the head, you'll have 10. Just sticking with the body, you can get all the numbers you want. The orifices, for example. The orifices? Yes. How many holes does the body have? I counted. Eyes, nostril, ears, mouth, ass, 8. You see, another reason 8 is a beautiful number. But I have 9, and with that 9th, I bring you into the world. Therefore, 9 is holier than 8. Or if you like, take the anatomy of your menhir, which your authors are always talking about. Standing up during the day, lying down at night, your thing too. No, don't tell me what it does at night. The fact is that erect it works and prone it rests. So the vertical position is life, pointing sunward, and obelisks stand as trees stand, while the horizontal position and night are sleep, death. All cultures worship menhirs, monoliths, pyramids, columns, but nobody bows down to balconies and railings. Did you ever hear of an archaic cult of the sacred banister? You see, and another point, if you worship a vertical stone, even if there are a lot of you, you can all see it. But if you worship instead a horizontal stone, only those in the front row can see it. And the others start pushing, me too, which is not a fitting sight for a magical ceremony. But rivers. Rivers are worshipped not because they're horizontal, but because there's water in them. And you don't need me to explain to you the relation between water and the body. Anyway, that's how we're put together, all of us, and that's why we work all the same symbols, millions of kilometres apart, and naturally they all resemble one another. Thus you see that people with a brain in their head, if they're shown an alchemist's oven, all shut up and warm inside, think of the belly of the mama making a baby, and only your diabolicals think that the Madonna about to have a child is a blah 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 blah, and so it goes on. So, why did I add that in? Because I think there's always an interesting relationship between the material, like actual, real, physical existence of the world and the way that our minds, culturally, across cultures, start to make associations and connections, start to make certain things symbolic. And I think that there's a kind of something to ponder in that about the relationship between myth and, say, reality, or the relationship between fact and fiction, because fiction can often show us something incredibly profound and significant. But this is a digression. I just thought that just when I was thinking about different paradigms of the body, called it cross cultures, I was thinking there are things that are really kind of cross-culturally universal. Like a friend of mine is writing a book he's writing a chapter in a book about the relationship between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and a Chinese martial art called Xingyi, and he's an expert in both Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Xingyi. And he was asked by the editor of the book to focus on the idea of the snake. So the snake in martial cultures, like anything that goes around, anything that snakes around and ties up like a lock, or anything that's grappling, people start to go, it's snaky, it's a snake. So anywhere in the world where there is the concept of a snake, where there is the animal of a snake, then as soon as you start to snake your arms round, then that's a snake. So the snake has this huge kind of symbolic, cross-cultural, almost trans-historical universal power. So this is digression. I don't want it to go on too long. If you want to email me about it, or we can Skype about it. If we had seminars, we might have been able to talk about it, but nonetheless. So, digression over. So what did I want to talk about here? I wanted to talk about I want to talk about embodiment, as this is a module that focuses on the body. And I wanted to refer you back to something that most of us, but not all of us on the module, looked at in the first year, which is the notion of the invention of tradition. So when I talk about the invention of tradition, or when I talk about invented tradition, I am referring explicitly to a book called it's an edited collection, so it's got lots of different essays in by different authors, called The Invention of Tradition, which is edited by Hobsbawm and Ranger, and it's a great book, and lots of it is available for free online. There are copies galore in the library. And a really important point that the whole book, this book came out in the 1980s, the whole book makes really important observations about things that we think are timeless and ancient, and that is that they are invented often relatively recently, and they're often invented for an explicit political or managerial purpose. So for some of you this is revision, for others this might be new. So the famous example that everyone remembers from the book is the idea of the invention of the Highland clans. Clans existed, the Highlands existed, people existed there. But Hobsbawm and Ranger argue that the invention of the idea, the cultural trappings, the clothes, the kilt, right? The kilt, the tartan, and all of it, the idea that this is an ancient Highland Scottish tradition from time immemorial is just simply not true. Okay, it's just a lie. The kilt was invented in Lancashire in the 18th century. The tartan was invented around the same kind of time, and it was attributed by historians, by a very inventive group of historians, to confer a strong sense of identity on the people and to claim that it was ancient and essentially kind of some kind of ethnically, uniquely Scottish. For a very long time, there'd been no real strong cultural distinction between people who lived in Scotland and the islands around Scotland and Ireland, and that it was really during the 18th century that strong senses of identity were invented, just made up. When I say the kilt was invented, you read the book, read the essay on the invention of the Highlanders, and the same goes for rituals that we think are ancient. They can just be made up, the drop of a hat, religious rituals, political rituals, cultural rituals, they can all just be made up, boom, just like that, okay? And it doesn't take us long to think that they have always been there, that it has always been like that, okay? So there are obvious examples around, say, like the notion of Christmas, the idea that Santa Claus, Father Christmas, Saint Nicholas, was effectively reinvented by Coca-Cola from the idea of some kind of being a green elf of some kind to being red to fit the branding of the product of Coca-Cola. So that's a famous example. And before that, you can go further back and go, well, all these traditions around, Christmas trees and Yule logs and so on, these were all effectively 19th century royal inventions. Okay, they're not simply ancient traditions. Now, this is not to say that things didn't happen in the ancient past. What it is to say is that people look at the past and go, ooh, that's interesting. And they go, well, we'll do that then, for whatever reason, because it's ancient, because it was from our ethnic past or from whichever past. And they invent traditions. So as we will look at with yoga, the same goes for yoga. Now, I've put myself, this is kind of like a little footnote to me here. So Roland Barthes, as you know, wrote a book called Mythologies that was published in 1957. And in Mythologies, what he essentially does is dissects and analyzes the kind of mythic ideological construction of certain ideas and certain images and what they signify and what they connote. But in that book, at the very end, there's a very long essay, not very long, it's kind of a hardcore essay, it's really tough, right? And it's called Myth Today. And in it, I'm going to close the window because there's a car alarm or something going off, or a burglar alarm. It's annoying. So in that book, he contrasts the kind of fake capitalist consumerist characters with the idea of the woodcutter. Okay, and the woodcutter for Roland Barthes is this, he pictures this guy who goes out into the woods and he works with like maybe homemade tools, and he has this kind of organic relationship with the world. And Roland Barthes actually uses that figure to kind of contrast the alienated life that we all live in, the myths that we believe. But actually people since then have said, hang on a minute, this figure that Roland Barthes is proposing is somehow organically real and somehow free from myth, actually then comes to have the status within Barthes' work of a myth, of a structuring myth, the structuring myth of the true, the real relationship with the world. So the woodcutter becomes like a fantasy, fetishistic figure. So why did I want to draw attention to that? I wanted to draw attention to that because it's actually very easy for all of us to kind of go, well, there's this consumerist world which is fake and bad and corporately organized and branded and marketed and sold to us. But then there's a real world that we could live in. This real world that would be free from myth and fakery. But actually, as soon as we start to think like that, then what we are doing is mythologizing the real. And this is precisely the idea that, this is what Ray Chow talks about when she talks about primitive passions. There's emergence of primitivism in modern societies. We start to fetishize the thing that we think is more organic or true. And I'm not saying that there's nothing in that. I mean, I would, far rather live in a more like scenic garden place with trees and woods, and it does feel more healthy to me than somewhere that was kind of polluted and high rise and all the rest of it. But the point is that this romantic relationship to nature, and I guess the word romantic is really useful because it was the romantic poets that we've all heard of. They were huge champions of the idea of nature and being in touch with nature, precisely at a time in history when that was starting to look rather threatened by population growth, by the kind of the birth pangs of industrialization and so on. So we can start to view things as symptoms, right? We start to view things as symptoms. We can start to view this desire to be in connection with the ancient or the natural as a symptom of our sense that we're disconnected from it, that we've lost something. And this leads us to an argument given by the sort of Marxist, sort of psychoanalytic cultural critic Slavoj Žižek. Now, Žižek is a really controversial figure. It's not Zizek or anything like Žižek. Okay. Now, Žižek wrote a book that came out in about 2001 called On Belief. And in that book, he proposes... I wish I would stop doing that. He proposes that the ultimate ideology, the ideal ideology of what he calls kind of modern consumer capitalism, or what we now quite comfortably call neoliberal capitalism, is what he calls Western Buddhism, Western Taoism. Okay, why does he argue that? He argues that. Let's have a look at it. I put this quotation here for a reason. I found this online, by the way. All these things, all these pictures, you just kind of Google the keywords and you just do an image search, and there you go. And you can often find, if you can find all sorts of. There's a new thing, right, called the internet. It's great. Anyway, so this is from Zizek's book. The ultimate postmodern irony of today is the strange exchange between Europe and Asia. At the very moment when European technology and capitalism are triumphing worldwide at the level of the economic infrastructure, the Judeo-Christian legacy is threatened at the level of ideological superstructure in the European space itself by New Age Asiatic thought, which, in its different guises, ranging from Western Buddhism to different Taos, is establishing itself as the hegemonic ideology of global capitalism. So, remember, with Zizek, we're dealing with, in this instance here, we're dealing with kind of crude Marxism. So you have the economic base, which is the economy, that's the basis of society, the actual industry and actual nature of the economy. And on top of that, you've got all the beliefs and things that feed in. You remember the map, the diagram? So you've got the economic base, and on top of that, the ideological infrastructure. That's the schools and the media and all of these different things. So Zizek argues that in the past, in the West, it used to be a kind of predominantly Judeo-Christian ideology. But now that something about the economic base, the transformation of the economy, is making new ideas seem more appealing and kind of work for more people. So remember, ideology in this world, in this Marxist world, is not propaganda, it's not lies. It's beliefs and practices that basically help you cope. So Max Weber, the Marxist sociologist, argued that, like beer in industrial societies, wine in agricultural and industrial societies, these are ideological objects. The church, going to church, having a belief system. It's not that it's false, it's that it's a belief system, right? It's not that beer is false or that wine is false. It's that it helps you cope with your job. It's what you need. Exercise helps. All the ideological system is a support for the economic base. So that's what we're dealing with here. Even though he's using ideas like hegemonic, he's not quite post-Marxist in that sense. That's a different lecture, okay? So the hegemonic ideology of global capitalism. Therein resides the highest speculative identity of opposites in today's global civilization. Although Western Buddhism presents itself as the remedy against the stressful tension of capitalist dynamics, allowing us to uncouple and retain inner peace and Gelassenheit, it actually functions as its perfect ideological supplement. So, shall we have a look at that? So Western Buddhism helps us cope. What does it help us cope with? Specifically, it helps us cope with the chaos caused by deregulated capitalism. So we're talking about a world in which our jobs are not secure, our pensions are not secure. There is no guaranteed continuity between school, qualification, vocational training, vocation, retirement, pension. When all that goes out the window because capital is deregulated, because things are not nationalised, they are privatised, and because the economy is more and more chaotic because it's not controlled centrally by strong legislation, then we need some way to cope with the chaos of that life. And Zizek's argument is that the ideology of flows, the idea of not clinging, the idea of going with the flow and just kind of riding the wave of things, is what's called here this philosophy of flow. This constant flux, the 10,000 things of the Tao, and flowing along, not clinging. This is what Zizek's talking about. This is the problem. The problem is that there's no certainties in this world anymore, certainly not in the economic structure because of capitalism. And so you need something that helps you to acknowledge the truth of that, the reality of that situation, and to cope, and maybe even to be happy. So, we can feel that our true selves, we're all working in a bank. Zizek gives this example later on as well in the same book, that he talks about the yuppie. So still in the 90s when he was writing this book, people talked about yuppies. The yuppie meditating or doing yoga or maybe doing Tai Chi or something like that, or feng shuiing their house. They believe that the real them is not them working in the bank or selling their stocks and shares, online. It's them when they're physically in their bodies meditating. But actually that's a myth, because Zizek is arguing from the Marxist perspective that their real truth, their real effect, their real impact, their real footprint, so to speak, is the stuff that they do in the economic realm. All of this stuff is ideology. These physical embodied practices are the ideological supplement to the stuff they get up to get paid for. Because from a Marxist perspective, what you do to get paid for, what you do to get paid, that's your truth, so to speak. That's your quintessence. So the Buddhist ideas, they are the ideological supplement. So we'll move on. So we'll go back to here from there. One should mention here the well-known concept of future shock that describes how people are no longer psychologically able to cope with the dazzling rhythm of technological development and the social changes that accompany it. Things simply move too fast, and before one can accustom himself to an invention, it has already been supplanted by a new one, so that one more and more lacks the most elementary cognitive mapping. Yeah? Straightforward? Okay. The recourse to Taoism or Buddhism offers a way out of this predicament that definitely works better than the desperate escape into old traditions. Aha. So the argument here is that, and actually Michael Hart and Antonio Negri in their book called Empire, which came out at about the same time, in about 2001-ish, right? Something like that. They argue that fundamentalisms like that. So on the one hand, you've got the retreat, they call it the kind of retreat or the move to fundamentalisms, and the sort of postmodern going with the flow. These are equally symptomatic responses to an uncertain world. So if you look at the world and go, shit, I can't keep up with this world. This world is batshit crazy and it's going to screw me over somehow. I'm really scared. You either need a philosophy that makes you go, yeah, it'll be all right. Boom, stretch, enjoy your body. Or you get one which goes, right, we need to get rid of this world and go back to an old world. So we need to go back to an older fundamentalist Christian world, or some kind of ultra-Orthodox Jewish world, or some kind of really strict Muslim world where we knew our hierarchies and we knew. So religious fundamentalisms, as much as kind of hippie ideologies, can be regarded as the signs of the times, symptoms of the times, and the practices associated with them can be similarly diagnosed by the cultural critics. So. Cognitive mapping, okay. So the recourse to Taoism or Buddhism offers a way out of this predicament that definitely works better than the desperate escape into old traditions. Instead of trying to cope with the accelerating rhythm of technological progress and social changes, one should rather renounce the very endeavour to retain control over what goes on, rejecting it as the expression of the modern logic of domination, what I was talking about before. One should instead let oneself go, drift along, while retaining an inner distance and indifference toward the mad dance of accelerated progress. A distance based on the insight that all this social and technological upheaval is ultimately just a non-substantial proliferation of semblances that do not really concern the innermost kernel of our being. So he's talking about the same thing. What is the ideological, what is the lived solution to uncertainty and chaos and all the rest of it. And he says, so this is what it means to say that Taoism and Western Buddhism, a modern Buddhism for a modern age, is the ideological is the hegemonic ideology of kind of modern neoliberal capitalism. It means this. Okay, so this is something that we can do when we look at practices like, say, yoga or meditating of any kind, qigong or whatever. You can historicize it. You know, the cultural critic will go, hang on, well, what is going on in what is going on in the world? The Marxist will go, what's going on in the economy, right? That made us have to do this kind of thing. Obviously, then there's other dimensions to this. So like this simply, there's books called like Selling Spirituality, which are about the way in which Western modern understandings of initially Eastern practices have become commodified, have become simplified, have become individualized. So the argument is that Taoism and Buddhism are really, really caring, not isolationist approaches to the world. And there's a huge industry around them. And in the West, it's a kind of weird warping or mutation or bastardization of them. That's a different debate, but by all means, well, yeah, let's not go there at the moment, okay? So, where do I want to go from this? I wanted to go, so having established that kind of larger idea of these, there are larger kind of structuring coordinates that we all born into history, we're born into culture, we think that we're free thinking, and we are free thinking, but what we're thinking about is stuff that's already there, present for us in the culture, in the world, the ideas that circulate in the discourse, right? in the discursive context. So we've got binaries of like Eastern wisdom, Eastern mysticism, which were really popularized by countercultural movements, hippies. And then we've got Western hard, cold, Western scientific method, rationality. There's no kind of space for emotions in this. There's no space for humanity. And in Western popular culture, you start to see, global, transnational popular culture, you start to see figures around, these stock type body types, because this is body image, isn't it? So you see types of bodies that we associate with certain things. Jane Uemura, she wrote a really interesting book called Virtual Orientalism. It's available in the library. More importantly, in these strange times, it's available as an ebook in the library. Okay. Also, a book by Adam Frank called Taiji Chuan and the Search for the Little Old Chinese Man. We associate certain types of practices with certain body types. So you might want to start Tai Chi, right? And what do you look for? You look for a certain type of instructor. You don't want to turn up to the Tai Chi class and it be some young white man. You want it to be ideally an old Chinese man, like with the beard and everything, because these ideas of the body type circulate and they get into our preconceptions. I've written myself a lot about these kind of myths and fantasies. They're scattered throughout a book that I wrote a few years ago called Mythologies of Martial Arts, which is also available in the library. And I wanted to, what time is it? Okay, I wanted to conclude this first section of the lecture with a focus on a case study. As you know, my inclination is always to talk about martial arts. And I can't even begin to understand why anyone would get bored of that. But there you go. We'll look at the case study of yoga. Now, there are 2 books on the reading list that are both available in the library, hopefully online. I believe ebooks, if they're not ebooks, I haven't checked. I should have checked. I'm sorry. The library buys ebooks, so ebooks. First one is a book, we've talked about it several times on the module already, by Ben Spatz. The chapter I'm recommending is chapter 2, The Invention of Postural Yoga, in the book called What a Body Can Do, Technique as Knowledge, Practice as Research. Great book. The other book is called Yoga Body by Mark Singleton, and that's a really fabulous and interesting book about the history of yoga. But because the primary reading is Ben Spatz, I want to walk you through some of it. So I've pulled out some quotations. So this section, I'm going to conclude this section with a lot of reading through of some really key passages. So, writes Ben Spatz. No recent example better illustrates what Mauss called the phenomenon of borrowing in the spread of techniques than the invention and meteoric ascent of postural yoga in the 20th century. So we remember Marcel Mauss and his argument about the spread of physical skills and movements, often by things like media. So Mauss's example was of people in Paris having seen an American movie, and then all of a sudden the people who were influenced by that film started to walk in a different way. Yeah? And the way that, so I mean, now this is like massively exponentially increased, isn't it? You might see, different types of musical subculture or different types of religious or any type of media images influencing our postures, the way we stand, the way we sit, the way we talk, the way we move, right? In so many ways. And I'm very much open to you writing about them, as long as you've got something. Well, I'll talk more about essay writing later on, but you always want to have your specific case, your specific example, right? Specific example of something. Don't talk in generalities, right? A specific text to analyze, from which you can say, well, the implications of this more widely are blah blah blah. Okay, so like other contemporary healing and martial arts, postural yoga draws on ancient sources, but is an invention of modern times. So we all like to think yoga's ancient. We all like to think we're somehow communing with the ancient. I know that when I started doing yoga, maybe a long time before you were born, right? And I loved it. I didn't love it as much as I loved Tai Chi. There was something magic. Tai Chi was the magical thing for me. It was the thing that I genuinely felt that I was somehow learning something ancient and something that was connected with a profound truth in some way, a profound universal, almost spiritual. I don't really know what spiritual means, but that kind of transcendent feeling of wow. And it's always a little bit of a blow when you go, hang on a second, it's an invention of modern times. I don't like the sound of that. And the argument here is that it draws on ancient sources, yes, but it's a reinvention, repackaged, reconstructed. So the phenomenon that Elizabeth D. Michaelis calls modern postural yoga in her book of 2005 is inextricably woven into globalization through discourses of health, fitness and spirituality. So when you look at your case study of something, what's woven into it? What do we judge it in terms of how does it fit into the world? Like, how do we think of the practice? With yoga, we think of health, fitness and spirituality. I guess we do that with Tai Chi as well, right? We don't think of athleticism necessarily, do we? Well, we'll get there. But we think of it in terms of health, fitness and spirituality. Who does yoga? Who does yoga, right? Women do yoga, do they? Yeah, older women maybe? Right, this is an argument. Is it gendered? Is the practice gendered? Who plays football? Who does boxing, right? Who does MMA? We tend to gender practices. Practices have a kind of gender so that we think there's something remarkable when people who don't conform to the stereotype that had constructed for us do that thing. We tend to go, that doesn't... Remember last week's lecture about classing society and everyone has a place in society? Well, it happens on this micro kind of stereotypical level as well, which Ray Chow calls coercive mimeticism, where we assume people should be into specific things because of their gender, ethnicity, age, class. Much of what is currently practiced under the name yoga dates to the early 20th century. It is not a direct continuation of ancient yogic tradition, but rather a conscious invention of modern times. Okay? There is no single ancient tradition of yoga, and those very old texts and documents that do exist have strikingly little in common with most current yoga practice. The authority of an allegedly ancient and classical tradition was grafted onto a set of distinctly modern practices. This is the thing about the invention of tradition. Things gain authority and gravitas by having a sense of their agedness attributed to them. So this is why you often find, especially within, say, East Asian martial arts, especially Chinese martial arts, they constantly have to have an ancient lineage, even if it was invented last week. It's an ancient lineage, or it was given to you in a direct transmission, or vision in a dream, or something. Because ancient and timeless means, well, it means authority, doesn't it? It means lineage. It means, it means longevity. It means so. This is what happened with yoga. Is the argument that it was repackaged in the 20th century as an ancient, wise, mystical Indian tradition. So historically, argues Spatz, yoga developed in a direct rivalry with European organisations like the YMCA. So remember a few weeks ago when we were talking about, possibly even the first lecture or the first two lectures, we were talking about the birth of physical culture, in the West with the YMCA. Well, that was matched in other geographical areas by the birth of their own institutions. So institutions in China like the Jingwu Association was a direct response to the Western Christian globalizing missionary project of the YMCA, the Young Man's Christian Association, which tried to make men more physical, stronger, and more Christian, right? So other cultures responded to that. They respond to Westernization by trying to invent their own strong sense of national identity, okay? Yoga rapidly expanded through the inclusion of physical technique borrowed from therapeutic gymnastics, calisthenics, and bodybuilding. The argument of Mark Singleton is that what we think of today as proper yoga, postural yoga, where you move around through different asanas or asanas, or however you pronounce it, bears much more of a relationship to Swiss gymnastics of the early 20th century. A few weeks ago, we watched some video clips of different forms of nationalistic physical exercise campaigns. We might see one yet, in response to COVID-19 and the coronavirus. We might see, well, schools are telling parents what PE their kids should be doing. We're seeing people offering free PE lessons online. We might yet see nationalistic responses. I don't know. It'd be quite interesting. Governments respond and go, "You should all be doing this, right? This is what you should be doing in this hour of need." So, no one deserves more credit for conducting influential and substantive research in yoga technique than Tirumalai Krishnamacharya. Okay, I think I pronounced that right. And this is a picture of Krishnamacharya here, who died in 1989. A renowned teacher and practitioner whose innovations in yoga technique have been enormously influential. By 1931, the Maharaja of Mysore had realised how much Krishnamacharya's mission was in line with his own desire to support and promote a distinctly Indian physical culture that could rival those of Europe. This story happens time and again in different emerging national contexts in the 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century. You see it in Japan. You see it with different nationalizations of martial arts, especially around things like kendo, Shotokan karate. You see it in China. You see it all. You're seeing it now as well, still in countries in the Philippines with their martial arts like Eskrima, Kali, Arnists. Okay, so the things have to produce a sense of national identity. Okay. So Sioman considers, I haven't read Sioman, okay, this is the quote from Spatz, considers Indian wrestling, bodybuilding and English gymnastics to be important parts of the landscape of physical culture within which Krishnamacharya was working and out of which the modern forms of postural yoga emerged. Through a point-by-point comparison between an 1896 gymnastics manual and the 1966 classic Light on Yoga by Krishnamacharya's most famous student, BKS Iyengar, Sioman shows that what emerged from Mysore during this period was a syncretism, drawing heavily on gymnastics but presenting it under the name of yoga. So, that's interesting, right? So a pure Indian thing, this thing that we think is pure and ancient. The word yoga has existed for millennia, right? It's an Indian word. It has existed, but what it means has changed. It just means different things at different times. You say yoga, you say, oh well, there's yoga reference in this ancient text. But it's not the same thing. It's the same word. It's not the same thing. So Mohan suggests that Krishnamacharya himself composed the Yoga Rahasya, a text that is traditionally attributed to the 10th century sage Nathamuni. This happens a lot as well. So a kind of modern-ish invention is given authority and gravitas and cultural capital by claiming it's based on something really ancient. Okay? So you see this in the martial arts in particular. You might know more about. You can find out more about other cultural practice and other cultural contexts. But these, in Tai Chi, you have the Taiji Classics, which are attributed to people hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, sometimes thousands of years ago. They were probably written by the people who were popularizing Tai Chi in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Probably written by them and passed off as ancient, because that's just better than like, yeah, I wrote it, I made it up. You can't. If you say that, you're appealing to a different logic of kind of cultural legitimation. Like if I say I made something up, then I'm saying I'm qualified to make it up. But if I say no, I'm following this tradition from the past, and I am now the bearer of this ancient tradition, then all my cultural capital comes from that, the venerable status of that. So Krishnamacharya drew into yoga much that would not previously have been considered relevant or permissible. The Surya Namaskara, or sun salutation, one of the first things we may think of when we picture the practice of yoga today, was in Krishnamacharya's time considered inappropriate for yoga because of its association with gymnastics and sun worship. Additionally, The use of movement and breath to connect one pose to another fundamentally transforms asana practice, bringing it closer to martial arts and dance. If you read the Mark Singleton book and some stuff that he's published online about this, about the invention of postural yoga, and how long should you hold a posture for, and how should you breathe, it's kind of like it was all made up. There's an argument that, so in yoga you're meant to, they say you hold each posture for 8 relaxed breaths. Why is that? Well, we could say 8 is a magic number, right? If we remember back to our digression, 8 is a magic number. But there's an argument that it was just so that when people like Iyengar were demonstrating the poses to either an audience or a new class of beginners, 8 breaths is about enough time that the person needed to take while the guy's walking around going, so you put your leg here and you do that and you rest that and you stretch that. 8 breaths is a reasonable amount of time before we move on to the next one. Or it could be something to do with universal health-related physical truths, right, and profundity. So we're almost at the end of this first section of the lecture. So I want to bring us up to yoga today. This is still quoting from Ben Spatz's books. And something that you might want to think about yoga today. Issues of branding and commercialism, exoticism and appropriation swirl in the contemporary landscape of yoga. Bikram Yoga is an extreme example of the standardization and commodification of postural yoga. There is a documentary on Netflix about Bikram Yoga, and it's absolutely compelling viewing. I would recommend you watch it anyway, whether we're in lockdown or whether we're in isolation or for any reason. It's about Bikram and his form of yoga and the myths he generated about himself, or the kind of aura he constructed around himself. So Bikram Yoga is an extreme example. Bikram's product is a particular synthesis of pedagogical and physical technique that, for reasons worth investigating, has had enormous appeal for a relatively privileged class of urban practitioners, all of which relates to what Spatz calls the health and fitness paradigm. So the word paradigm is useful here for talking about different paradigms of medicine, Eastern and Western, different paradigms of the body, whether it's mechanistic and can be cured by a pill, or whether it's holistic and has to be cured by systemic rebalancing. These are different paradigms of medicine, and Spatz talks about different paradigms of health and fitness. We operate in what Spatz calls the paradigm of healthism. You have to look healthy before you're healthy, right? So if you're a man, you have to have muscles, you have to have the less fat, the better, etc., etc. If you're a woman, it's kind of verging that way more and more, arguably now. But you can't be fit unless you look like an Olympic athlete, okay? Which is problematic. So, the influence of healthism upon the practices it frames goes beyond language to shape the ways in which technique from all over the world is altered and assimilated in order to fit within the relatively uniform environment of the gym, studio, or health club. So techniques and traditions from the world are kind of deracinated, fragmented, maybe taken in bits and reconstituted within the backdrop, within the world, the lab of a gym, a studio, or a health club. In this regard, the transformation of yoga is exactly parallel to the crossover into mainstream fitness of the work of Joseph Pilates. The transformation of hip-hop dance into aerobic exercise in fitness clubs, and many other recent healthist reframings of embodied technique. So hip-hop's a really interesting case. It has it has a strong probable connection with the Afro-Brazilian martial art of capoeira, which itself is such an interesting and complicated practice. Like, is it a dance? Is it a martial art? Was it invented by slaves in the colonies? Was it brought from Africa intact? So is it African, or is it a colonial product? So many different arguments here. And capoeira is a really interesting thing, because also it's like yoga. it's really, really popular in the West precisely because it seems to have this mystical kind of cachet, this cool, because was it the slaves? Is it a kind of cool underclass thing? And that becomes a cool middle class thing because of the fetishism of the idea of the ancient or of the slave or of the ethnic. So fetishizing, the ethnic identity is a huge problem and issue, and you can research that. We can talk about that. Anyway, as embodied disciplines like yoga, kung fu, tai chi chuan, capoeira, hip hop, and tango are all repackaged to become health and fitness modalities. So you take a tango class to get fit, and that's a reconstruction of a dance that was constructed in certain contexts and mythologized subsequently, and it becomes associated with regional and national identities and maybe ethnic identities too. And then it becomes globalized, or there's a diasporic spread around the world, and it finds a home in health clubs and fitness clubs, and it becomes Zumba. It becomes a dance class. It falls into the health and fitness paradigm. Okay. They're all repackaged to become health and fitness modalities. They undergo sometimes radical changes at the level of technique. Certain aspects of the technique that previously structured them are extracted for use, while others are forgotten or ignored. At its most extreme, healthism reduces all forms of embodied technique to different flavors of exercise, all of which are directed towards a single reductive image of health. It then becomes possible to ask in all sincerity, will yoga make me thin and happy? While such a question says little about yoga and virtually nothing about health, it tells us a great deal about today's biopolitical landscape and about the pressures faced by anyone who hopes to learn or teach yoga within it. So you can look at texts about practices, and the kind of questions that they seem to answer tells us a lot about the way in which that practice is being constructed within the contemporary context. Like I've recently started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and the entire discourse of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, outside of the stuff about fighting, and it's fighting, it's self-defense and sport, but everything else is like lose weight through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is about losing weight, lose weight. I think that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is kind of like it's a modern masculine yoga. It operates in the same kind of cultural context as yoga. You need mats on the floor. It's ideal for men. You can be competitive or not competitive. There's a lot of kind of male bonding. It is very male. It doesn't have to just be male, but it's very male. It's becoming less so. I think it's also, but by the same token, I'm not dismissing it in any way. I love it, but it's also potentially feminist martial art in the sense that it's the one martial art that delivers the capacity for women to genuinely be able to subdue a much stronger, more aggressive man, which we can talk about another time, or maybe you're not interested in that. But if anyone has questions, talk to me about that. And this is the final slide of this first half of the lecture. I've run on for longer than I intended, so sorry, apologies for that. This is the final slide, I think. Modern postural yoga has been gradually athleticized. It has achieved its extraordinary popularity through its specific alignment with athleticism and through the dominant assumption that athletic prowess is equivalent to health. This is a significant matter for yoga practitioners because the equation of athletic ability and health is erroneous. As Nancy Theberge points out in an essay on sports medicine, the idea that top athletes are paradigms of health is incorrect. Theberge cites an interview with an Olympic-level sports medicine administrator who recalls being asked what it's like to work with the healthiest people on the planet. The interviewee recounts his response. Well, I want to make a distinction here. This is all about performance. This is not about health. These are not healthy people that we are sending to the Olympics. These are incredibly high performers, and there's a major distinction. If you looked at the medical file of each and every one of these people, you would be horrified at the kinds of things they get exposed to. They get sick more often, they get injured more often, they get depressed more often. So it's not about health, it's about performance. So yeah, we'll take a break there. run on quite a long time, but there's so many issues and ideas. In the second half of the lecture, I'm going to give more examples from martial arts. I'm going to talk a bit about ways that you might think about your essays, how you might write an essay for this module, because I know a lot of you are worried about that, but I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah, see you later. No idea if I'm still recording, actually. God damn. Fucking